I wasn't supposed to find this. The courthouse basement in Buchanan County had been sealed for decades, a storage vault that no one touched, but the summer flood pushed a section of the stone wall loose, spilling muddy water into the archives. My assignment was routine: help document the damage for the Historical Society, but when the workmen cleared the debris, I saw something wedged deep in the recess of the collapsed wall. Not a box. Not a file. A ledger, wrapped in oilcloth that had rotted into a black film. It smelled of wet soil and rust, a kind of metallic sweetness that clung to my throat. I unwrapped it with gloves, but even through the latex I felt the leather cover soften to pulp. The first pages disintegrated at a breath, words bleeding into sludge. Yet beneath the decay, the ink endured in fragments, tall, deliberate handwriting, neat columns, annotations that were more like judgments than notes. The name that appeared, again and again, across the brittle paper was one I had never heard before: the Halloways. Not a family I remembered from census rolls, not a name etched into the war memorials or church plaques scattered across the town. But each entry carried their surname with unsettling precision, sometimes followed by a cross mark, sometimes by a date, and in several cases, by nothing at all, only a blank space, as though the writer expected the reader to understand without explanation. What unnerved me most wasn't the handwriting, but the silence between the words. Entire pages had been blotted out with thick tar-like ink. Others were cut, cleanly, as though razored free. On the inside back cover, scratched so faintly it might have been mistaken for accidental wear, was a number, 97. Not written in ink, but gouged into the leather like a wound. The air in that room was heavy, thick with the rot of wood and mildew, but also with something else, an absence. No insects, no skittering mice, no hum of electricity. Only the drip of floodwater pooling at my feet and the hollow echo of each breath I dared to take. I should have logged the find, sealed it, and handed it over to the county. That was procedure. That was safety. But my chest tightened the longer I stared at the ledger. It felt less like discovery and more like inheritance. On the final intact page, a note appeared in a different hand, smaller, rushed, as if written under duress: "The doctrine is not to be spoken. The family endures." That was all. No date, no signature. Just those words, crammed into the corner margin like a confession someone hoped would remain unseen. I shut the ledger but could not leave it. Hours later, when the workmen sealed the basement again, I carried it out in my satchel. I told myself it was for research, for preservation, but in truth, I felt I had already crossed a line. The ledger was not meant to survive the flood. It had hidden in stone for generations, waiting for someone unwise enough to unbind it. I did not sleep that night. The name repeated in my head: the Halloways, the Hollow Doctrine, 97. No matter how I tried to rationalize it, the words carried a weight that pressed on my lungs. A pressure I could not explain. I should have walked away, but there is a peculiar cruelty in human curiosity. Once something forbidden has been glimpsed, it gnaws at you until the only relief is to dig deeper. I traced the Halloway name through census archives, marriage licenses, and county land deeds, but it was as though the family had been erased. No births recorded, no burials marked, no property claimed. And then, buried in a brittle county health bulletin from 1912, I found the first trace: the Halloway School for Reformation. It wasn't listed in the education registry. Not exactly. Instead, it appeared in the margin of a state expenditure report, a line item folded under Community Charities. The ledger described it as a rural initiative for the improvement of ungovernable children. Its address was given as Halloway Ridge, though no such ridge appears on current maps. The official narrative was pristine, almost rehearsed. Clippings in the Appalachian Gazette praised the school for moral correction and discipline of the wayward. Politicians made speeches about its noble intent, transforming the children of miners and widows into industrious citizens. The institution was lauded as an anchor for struggling families, a beacon that promised both education and salvation. But beneath the rhetoric, something was wrong. In every report, children were admitted. None were released. The intake lists went on for years, boys and girls between the ages of 6 and 16, their names carefully recorded, sometimes even accompanied by parent signatures. Yet when I searched later census rolls, those names vanished. No adults emerged from the records, no marriages, no property deeds. It was as if they had been swallowed whole. The man credited with founding the school was Reverend Elias Halloway. His photograph survives in the archives of the Presbyterian Mission Board, a narrow-faced man with intense, searching eyes. He was not born in Buchanan, nor even in Virginia, but came down from Philadelphia around 1899. His sermons, preserved in brittle pamphlets, spoke of mending the bloodlines of the mountain poor, and hewing corruption from the flesh of God's children. At first, I thought his language was metaphorical, Victorian excess. But in the ledgers, the words sharpened. Margins filled with notations like, line corrected, strain removed, and, disturbingly, child unsuitable, doctrine applies. The doctrine. The same phrase from the ledger I found in the courthouse. I tried to find photographs of the school itself. None survive. The only images come from hand-drawn sketches in a 1915 fundraising brochure, a long clapboard building on a barren ridge, ringed with fencing, flanked by a small chapel. The brochure assured donors that the children were housed, clothed, and reformed under strict but loving guidance. Yet in county records, requisitions tell another story: shipments of lime, formaldehyde, and heavy locks. I reached out to the descendants of families whose children were listed in the intake rosters. Most didn't know the names at all. Some said the stories had been scrubbed out by embarrassed ancestors. But one elderly woman, Mrs. Callahan, whispered into the phone before hanging up, "We were told never to ask about Halloway Ridge. The children weren't meant to come back." When I replayed her voice on the recording, I realized she had said, "weren't allowed to come back." The system hid itself beneath the veneer of charity, using faith and reform as a shield. Every institution in Appalachia seemed to play its part: churches that directed families to the school, county officials who approved funding without question, newspapers that repeated the glowing reports. Reverend Halloway positioned himself as a savior, but the trail of children's names whispered otherwise. I shut the file that night, yet I couldn't shake the thought: if the school swallowed so many, then what remains on that ridge? What is left to find where no map dares to mark? The deeper I dug into the Halloway school, the less human it became. The records didn't merely stop, they bled out, thinning into uniformity until the people inside ceased to exist as individuals. At first it seemed like clerical error. Letters sent home from students, filed neatly in the mission board's archives, all carried the same stilted phrasing: "I am improving under the doctrine. I work hard. I am grateful for your sacrifice." The handwriting varied slightly, but the sentences never did. It was as if a template had been handed out, the children instructed to fill in blanks with their names. Yet even the names began to dissolve. By 1917, signatures on those letters shortened to initials. By 1920, the initials became symbols, crude marks like slashes or circles. Then, nothing at all, pages ending in empty space, the voice erased before the pen left the paper. In a folder mislabeled as "Staff Evaluations," I found a testimony that chilled me. It belonged to a teacher, Clara Winthrop, who served at the school for 2 years. She wrote, "They are forgetting themselves." One boy, Andrew Miller, insisted at first on being called by his Christian name, but within months he no longer recognized it. When asked, he repeated only the number sewn into his collar, 12. Another girl wept because she could not recall her birthday, only that she was after 7, before 9. When I raised concern with Reverend Halloway, he said the doctrine was working. He told me memory was corruption, we were to cut it away. Her file ended abruptly. No resignation letter, no forwarding address. Only a single loose sheet, written in a trembling hand: if I forget who I am, will someone remember for me? I visited an abandoned cemetery outside Grundy, where unmarked stones leaned against each other like broken teeth. Local lore claimed they were pauper graves, but the stones bore faint scratches, initials overwritten, then gouged out entirely. One marker showed 3 names carved in layers, each erased by the next, until the stone face was nearly smooth. That night I dreamed of rows of children lined up for portraits. The photographs I had seen in the archives were identical, same backdrop, same rigid pose, same vacant gaze. Only the faces changed, and even then, only slightly. By the time I reached the last page of the album, I could not distinguish one child from another. They blurred, like copies of a copy, until they might have been one single face repeated across decades. I tried to verify the existence of Andrew Miller. Birth certificates listed him. The 1910 census recorded him as the son of a coal miner. But after his admission to the Holloway School in 1913, he vanished. No military draft card in 1918. No marriage license. No obituary. His younger sister, who had remained in town, left a single diary entry before her death, and he stopped writing. When I saw him last, he did not know me. He smiled but called me by the wrong name. It wasn't just the children. Staff, too, began to disappear in fragments. In the Presbyterian Directory of 1921, Reverend Holloway himself is listed only as D.H., Director. No first name, no parish. A man reduced to initials, like the students he commanded. This was not neglect. It was deliberate. Erasure was the doctrine. And if their records could be blotted out so easily, I wondered, how much of what I know of my own family, my own name, rests on paper that might just as easily vanish. The Holloway School's main building no longer stands, dismantled by WPA laborers in the 1930s, but the ridge still bears its scars. Locals avoid it. The trees grow thin and crooked there, their roots breaking against stone that shouldn't be so close to the surface. When I finally climbed the ridge myself, the earth gave way under my boots, revealing a hollow cavity. Inside was the smell of limestone and something older, iron and mildew, mixed with the faint sweetness of decay. What I found was not a basement. It was an understructure. The first chamber was hewn directly into the rock, lined with narrow alcoves like burial slots. The walls bore scratches, not inscriptions, patterns of circles and slashes that repeated the same symbols I had seen in the students' letters. A tunnel extended beyond, leading me into what could only be described as a system of catacombs. The architecture was wrong. Stairs led down only to return me to the same level. A doorway I passed through reappeared behind me, though I swore I had not turned. I marked my path with chalk, yet the mark sometimes shifted, sometimes doubled, sometimes vanished entirely. The school, it seemed, had been built atop something older, an architecture designed not for use, but for disorientation. In a side chamber, I found remnants of what might have been therapy. Rows of wooden chairs faced blank walls. Leather straps dangled from their arms. Beside them, glass bottles labeled laudanum, chloroform, and a powdery residue in cracked porcelain bowls. The air still carried their bitterness. I thought of the children, dosed into silence, made pliant by narcotics, then left strapped in the dark until their names slipped away. Photographs, preserved in tin cases scattered on the floor, showed boys and girls with cloth wrapped over their eyes, their mouths shut with gauze strips. The captions written beneath read, "Doctrine Session, Progress Marked." I tried to steady my breathing, but the chambers worked on me as they must have worked on them. Sound fell wrong here. My footsteps echoed seconds late, as if someone followed just behind. My flashlight beam warped against the walls, bending at odd angles, sometimes illuminating corners that weren't there before. Then came the first unreality. In one chamber stood a cracked mirror, leaning against the wall. My reflection appeared faint at first, then stronger, until it seemed brighter than the room around it. My own face did not move with me. Its lips quivered, whispering, though I could hear no sound. And when I drew closer, the glass fogged from the inside, as if a breath issued outward, toward me. I stumbled back, striking a wall. The stone was wet. In the circle of my flashlight, moisture bled outward from the seams between blocks, dark, viscous, red. It ran slowly down to the floor and pooled at my feet. Yet when I bent to touch it, my fingers came away dry. I fled the chamber then, yet not in panic. There was a pull, a logic I could not deny. The doctrine had not been confined to doctrine, it had been carved into space itself, built into stone. A system that consumed children not only by breaking their memory, but by swallowing them whole, drawing them into a geometry that refused to release them. When I finally emerged, hours later, I had not climbed upward. I had merely stepped out. The ridge lay quiet, the hollow behind me sealed in shadow. But the smell lingered on my clothes. And in my satchel, the chalk marks I had made had bled into one another until they formed a single, perfect circle. I had convinced myself that the Holloway School was an aberration, a cruel local experiment hidden in the folds of the Appalachian Mountains. But the ledger told a different story. In the back pocket of the book I first found in the courthouse basement, there was a folded sheet so thin it nearly dissolved in my hands. On it, drawn in faded blue ink, was a crude map of the eastern United States. Small crosses dotted the paper: Kentucky, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Tennessee. Some were circled, others scratched out. And near the bottom, written in the same tall script I now recognized as Reverend Elias Holloway's, was a phrase: "The Doctrine Travels." I began to dig. The archives at the Virginia Historical Society carried student transfer records, though not labeled as such. They appeared in health registries, coded under reassignments. Children sent from Holloway Ridge were listed as arriving at sister institutions. One in Asheville, the Calder House of Correction. One in Pittsburgh, the Fifth Street Mission School. A site outside Lexington simply called the Orchard. Each bore the same symbols I had seen carved into the catacomb walls: circles, slashes, unfinished crosses. I found a report written in 1923 by a state inspector who visited Calder House. He praised their unparalleled silence regimen and their uniform discipline of the voice. That phrase struck me. Silence regimen. Uniform discipline. Different towns, different decades, but the same language, the same machinery at work. Then came the photographs. A set of class portraits from the Orchard in 1926, wooden benches, scrubbed children staring past the camera, all identical in pose and expression. And when I laid them beside the Holloway album, the faces were indistinguishable. Not merely similar, interchangeable. It was as though the children had been recast, reposed, rephotographed in an endless loop across the institutions. The more I mapped, the less I slept. I pinned copies of the sites across my wall. A pattern emerged, not random, not scattered. The schools formed a lattice, each within a day's rail journey of the next. As though the children were being passed along a chain. As though the doctrine was not local at all, but networked. And then came the name. Buried in a Presbyterian Synod minutes from 1907, mentioned only once in a line about funding oversight for mountain schools, the Order of the Fifth Veil. I thought it was a mistranslation, perhaps a ceremonial flourish. But it appeared again, on a registry of benefactors in Pittsburgh, in a letterhead embossed faintly into stationery found in the Orchard's ruins, and on a donation receipt in my own county. The order funded, guided, and concealed the institutions. They were the architecture behind the architecture. I might have dismissed it as conspiracy, had I not found my own name. In the Buchanan County archives, beneath the transfer records, I came upon a family tree annotated in pencil. The Callahans, the Millers, the McBrides, all familiar from the rosters of vanished children. And there, scrawled at the edge, my grandmother's maiden name, Whitaker. Next to it, in cramped script, Orchard, 1932, transferred, survived. Survived. I sat there for hours, staring at the word. My grandmother had never spoken of such a place. She had told us she was raised in a convent school after her parents' death. But the convent she named does not appear in any directory. What if it never existed? What if the stories she told were covers, half-truths given to conceal scars left by the doctrine? The ledger in my possession, the map, the registry, they were not relics. They were warnings. The doctrine was not buried with Elias Holloway. It spread, disguised as charity, preserved under the banners of reform and faith. The evidence I had gathered could topple the veil. Maps, ledgers, photographs, testimonies, all pointing to a century-spanning system of erasure. Yet the more I uncovered, the less I knew what justice would mean. The survivors, if that word even fit, were not whole. In the Appalachian genealogy forums, I had connected with a man who claimed his mother came back from the orchard. We met in a church basement in Lexington, beneath buzzing fluorescent lights. He was middle-aged, but his hands shook as he lit a cigarette. "She doesn't know me," he said. "She looks at me like I'm someone she's supposed to love, but the word won't come to her lips. It's gone. They took her language of family. If you publish what you found, will that give her name back?" His question lingered like smoke in my lungs. Later that week, I returned to the ridge. I don't know why, perhaps to see if there was still something breathing under the earth, or perhaps to confront the doctrine one last time. The hollow beneath the ground opened too easily, as though the stone itself wanted me back. Inside, in a chamber I hadn't entered before, I found them. Rows of small iron beds lined against the wall, rusted but intact. And on one bed, impossibly preserved, lay the figure of a child. Not flesh. Not bone. Something caught between memory and shadow, skin translucent, eyes closed as if in shallow sleep. A girl, perhaps 10. Her lips moved. Not sound at first, only the shape of words. Then, faint as water dripping through stone, "Will it matter if I get out?" I froze. The flashlight trembled in my hand. Her chest rose, shallow, as if she had been waiting decades only to ask that one question. Behind her, the walls bled symbols, slashes, circles, crosses, shifting faintly, as if the stone itself breathed. I wanted to tell her yes. That memory mattered, that truth mattered. But the files I carried, the names I could publish, would not set her free. They would only drag families into ruin, tearing open wounds that had been sutured shut in silence. I whispered back, "I don't know." Her eyes opened then, white and unblinking, filled not with fear but with expectation. A demand. When I returned home, I laid everything out on my desk, the ledger, the transfer lists, the map of institutions. I thought of my grandmother, who had smiled at me across kitchen tables, who hummed hymns with a voice that sometimes faltered mid-verse, as if forgetting the tune. If I exposed the doctrine, would unmake her, too. Every scar she buried would be dragged into light, every silence shattered. But if I burned it, the Halloways would remain unspoken, the fifth veil intact. The children, forgotten, faceless, would vanish into erasure forever. There is no victory in such a choice. Only consequence. I struck the match. The flame bloomed soft and gold, eating the paper fibers like hungry mouths. Names curled into ash. Faces crumbled. The map blistered at its edges, turning all the crosses to smoke. I did not watch it finish. When the last record fell to cinders, I left a single candle burning on my desk. Not for remembrance. Not for penance. But for testimony. The official report came out 2 weeks later. Electrical fire in Buchanan County Historical Annex. No injuries. Minor loss of non-essential records. That was all. A single column buried in the Appalachian Gazette. The photographs showed the courthouse basement sealed in scaffolding, smoke stains haloing the stones. No mention of ledgers. No mention of maps. No mention of the Holloway School. When I returned, the vault where I had first uncovered the ledger was filled with fresh concrete. County clerks shuffled papers on their desks as if nothing had been touched. They smiled politely, but their eyes slid away from mine, as if they sensed something clung to me still. What was lost was incalculable. The photographs, the class rosters, the testimonies, they were now ash in my lungs. Even my notes, which I had kept in a locked drawer, were gone. The drawer stood open when I returned home, the pages neatly removed. Not stolen with force. Removed with care, as if excised by an archivist. And yet, not everything was gone. In the rubble of the ridge, where the hollow had breathed beneath the school, I found one thing left behind. A locket, tarnished and thin, its hinge rusted but intact. Inside, a child's sketch had been folded, yellowed by years, drawn in uneven pencil. Not of a family, not of a home, but of a circle, perfect and unbroken. Beneath it, in faint script, "I am still here." The papers would say otherwise. The archives would misfile the names. Bones unearthed on construction sites would be labeled pauper remains, and carted away without ceremony. In time, families would forget to ask, or perhaps they would grow weary of asking, and silence would win again. But the locket rests on my desk now, beside the candle I cannot bring myself to extinguish. At night, when the house is quiet, I sometimes hear it, the faint whisper of a name, though I cannot tell which. It is never the same twice. Sometimes Andrew. Sometimes Clara. Sometimes a name I do not know, spoken in a voice that sounds like it belongs to me. I wasn't supposed to find this. That thought has come full circle. I was not supposed to enter that basement, was not supposed to unbind the ledger, was not supposed to trace the Holloways beyond their own erasure. And yet I did. And the cost of finding has been to carry what cannot be set down. The doctrine was never just a school, never just a ridge, never just the order of the fifth veil. It was an inheritance of silence, passed like blood, carried through generations that learned to look away. And though the evidence is ash, though the ledgers are burned, the names remain, pressed into stone, carved into wood, etched into bone. Waiting. The candle burns low. The locket gleams faintly in its light. And in that glow, I almost see her, the child in the bed, the question in her eyes. Will it matter if I get out? I whisper the only answer left. It matters because you were. And in the silence that follows, the flame bends as though breathed upon, and the circle on the child's sketch seems to widen, wider, until it could swallow the room whole. 1.